Today's episode is sponsored by my friends at Flint Custom Hats, right here in Lubbock, Texas. I've been wearing Flint custom hats for over 20 years, and based on that experience, I can highly recommend the craftsmanship, durability, and fit of a Flint custom hat. Each hat is handmade at their shop here in Lubbock, Texas, and they can make a hat to your exact specifications to fit your head. You can check them out online at flinthat.com. I'd like to start today's show with a poem written by a friend of Charlie Russell's named Johnny Rich. Johnny Rich published this in a book called Horse Feathers, and Charlie Russell gave him a watercolor illustration for each verse. I first heard this recited by the great old-time cowboy singer Glenn Orland, and today's guest also does a fine recitation of this piece. Here's Shorty Saloon by Johnny Rich. By the trails to the past on the plains of no care stood Shorty Saloon. But now it's not there, for Shorty moved camp and crossed the divide. In the years-long dim and naught else beside, a deep brand on memory brings back the old place. Its drinks and its games, and many a face peers out from the mists of days that are fled when Shorty leaned over his bar there and said, "What's yours, pard?" No fine drinks adorned that primitive bar, just liquor was served, and that seemed by far the properest stuff in a place, you'll agree, where life flowed and ebbed like the tides of a sea, unfettered by care, unmeasured by time, where innocence formed its first friendships with crime, where Bacchus' wild court held ribald with sway, and Shorty on shift stood waiting to say, "What's yours, pard?" Great herds from the south swept by on the trail, and stages sped westward top-heavy with mail for camps far beyond where gold was the lust, and freighters and bull trains sent whirlwinds of dust that scattered and spread far out on the plain. And men from the wild, hard men that sin's stain had marked like a brand, all stopped there, you see, and Shorty's brief welcome to each one would be, "What's yours, pard?" And up from the vast, silent stretch of the range, from line camps and roundups and all of the strange, lone places in cowland, men came there to play in that drama whose artists all lived by the way. Their skyline of life blazed crimson and gold, for hope gave them wealth and youth made them bold, and strong in life's strife to dare any task. And liquor was theirs when Shorty would ask, "What's yours, pard?" They danced and they drank and they sang that old song, "I'm just a poor cowboy and know I've done wrong," while the click of the chips and the games that were played and the sob in the music the violin made rang out through the smoke that clouded the room, for joy held the top hand and drink drowned all gloom the future might hold for him who made gay, and life filled with sunbeams when Shorty would say, "What's yours, pard?" Some tragedies mark those trails to the past. Some lone, unnamed graves tell briefly the last of the story of those who lived ere the change from that wild, free life of the borderless range. But memory's kind grasp holds gently the place, its drinks and its games, and many a face peers out from the mists of days that are fled, when Shorty leaned over his bar there and said, "What's yours, pard?" Howdy folks, this is Andy Hedges, and you're listening to Cowboy Crossroads. On each episode, I interview a different guest and ask them to share stories and discuss music, poetry, and culture from the working cowboy west and beyond. My guest today is Randy Rieman. Randy Rieman is a horseman, a rawhide braider, and one of the finest reciters of traditional cowboy poetry. If you haven't already, I'd recommend going back and listening to the first part of this interview with Randy on the last episode of the podcast. In this second part of our interview, Randy continues to discuss the life and work of Charles M. Russell and read from his illustrated letters. Here's Randy Rieman.
You know, his writing isn't real legible, but it is legible, and the spelling is remarkable. I mean, the word remain, I remain your friend, he would spell it R-E-M-A-N-E. And he oftentimes misspelled his friends' names, and a lot of stuff was really misspelled. But if you just sounded it out, you got the word. And so he never changed that all the way through. And it wasn't an affectation. He wasn't doing that as a gimmick. That was him. That was for real. The content was brilliant. And he talked, and we'll get to that maybe, there were some very serious letters dealing with things that are deep topics, Native American concerns of the time, social things of the time. But I think what it was Charlie was just a natural storyteller, but the way he liked best to tell a story was through visual art. But he wanted to communicate and answer letters and talk to these friends, so I think he was willing to suffer through the writing part. The story was easy for him, but he got better and better at the writing part as time went on. There's one letter to I can't remember the Hollywood celebrity now, but it's a picture of Charlie at a desk trying to write a letter. It's a self-portrait kind of thing, and you can tell he's under a lot of duress, and it's really hard for him, and he admits it in the letter. You know, he said, "I'm better than a green hand with a brush, but writing is hard work for me." And so I think when he wrote these letters, I don't think he realized how treasured they'd be, because I don't think he valued maybe his work as much as everybody else did. I think that he never really took himself super serious, and he oftentimes sort of played down the value of his work when you read about him. So I think he just valued his friends. He valued his clients. Something that I always thought was a connection between a friend of mine, Bill Dorrance, Bill was a remarkable human being and super humble also. Everything I can find out about Charlie, he was a really humble guy. I mean, genuinely humble, but super gifted. And so was Bill. But Bill didn't care as much about what you thought of him as he did about the subject matter that he was important to him. In other words, with Bill, rawhide braiding and roping and riding horses and giving him a fair deal, that's what really captured Bill's mind and heart and thoughts. And if you had those same values, it didn't matter if you liked Bill or didn't like him. He didn't really care one way or the other about that. Everybody liked him because he's so likable. But what he cared about was you had that same heartfelt passion for the subject matter that interested him. And I kind of think that these letters went to the people who had the same heartfelt passion for the subject matter. And I don't think Charlie viewed them as the priceless pieces they've become by now. I just think it was his way of keeping that friendship and that relationship with fellow like-minded individuals who loved the Old West, who cherished it, who missed it and reminisced about it. I feel like that was part of Charlie's very nature, that you couldn't erase that out of him. That's going to come through, and it does come through everywhere. And I feel like when you see who these letters went to, they were people he valued. They were people who had, for the most part, shared experiences. And if not the shared experiences, they had the passionate interest in the subject matter, be it the Plains Indians, be it the cowboys, be it the landscapes, or the wild animals on those landscapes. And so I can't imagine what Charlie I doubt if he ever sent a letter. This is just my own opinion. I can't back it up with anything. But everything I've read about his character was he was a super admirable guy and really honorable guy. And I can't imagine that he did this thinking, this is going to be worth a fortune someday. I don't think that was it at all. I think he did it because he loved the people he was sending them to, or respected them enough and took it serious enough to communicate. And I think also to tell people, like there's a couple letters here, very, very beautiful letters that he sent to just an art client who he'd never met, who wanted to know about the painting. And Charlie took it very serious to explain, this is why I painted this letter, painted this painting. The letter says, I'll read one of them to you. This is very interesting. One of Charlie's favorite paintings of mine, personally, is called The Medicine Man. But it's not just The Medicine Man. That's not the full title. Charlie did this a lot, and I laugh about it. He painted he used the same title for different paintings, and then he'd just number them. So this is The Medicine Man 2. He painted 4 paintings called The Medicine Man, and he just numbered them. The Medicine Man 1, The Medicine Man 2. He did that with the Roundup painting, as he's really famous Roundup pictures, and there are half a dozen of those. He wasn't afraid to do the same thing twice, But he wrote this letter to a fella who actually purchased this painting, The Medicine Man, and the painting is phenomenal. It's one of my personal favorites. It's along an area that I don't live very far away from, the Highwood Mountains, right out of Great Falls, Montana, and there's a really dynamic skyline, and it's Haystack and Steamboat Butte, which are on the edge of the horizon, and the horizon is the silhouette of the Highwood Mountains, and it was country Charlie was real familiar with, and it was country that the Blackfeet were in. It was all part of their home range. And so here's this great picture, but there's no explanation. So the fellow asked Charlie about it, and Charlie wrote this in response. This was in 1911. He said, "The Medicine Man I consider one of the best pieces of my work, and these few words may give you some idea of the meaning of the picture." So what that tells me right there is Charlie evaluated his own work, and there were pieces he liked and pieces probably he didn't, just like most artists that you speak with. But he's admitting here, which is pretty interesting. It's the only example I can find of him saying this is one of my favorite pieces. And I'm not sure if it was a favorite because of the actual execution of the painting or the subject matter. I'm not really sure, but I'll continue with the letter. "The Medicine Man I consider one of my best pieces of work, and these few words may give you some idea of the meaning of the picture. The medicine man among the Plains Indians often had more to do with the movements of his people than the chief. He is supposed to have the power to speak with the spirits and animals. His painting represents a band of Blackfeet Indians with their medicine man in the foreground. The landscape was taken from a sketch I made on Lone Tree Creek in the Judith Basin, and I remember when this was a game country. The mountain range is the high woods, with Haystack and Steamboat Buttes to the right. The Blackfeet once claimed all country from the Saskatchewan south to the Yellowstone, and one of their favorite hunting grounds was the Judith Basin. This country today is fenced and settled by ranchmen and farmers with nothing but a few deep worn trails where once walked the buffalo. I am glad, Mr. Kilmer, that I knew this country before nature's enemy, the white man, invaded and marred its beauty. Sincerely, C.M. Russell." Well, it's not hard to hear in that what Charlie thought of what the landscape looked like now compared to what it looked like when he first saw it. And I can't blame him for that sentiment, and it's kind of a hard letter to read because it puts ranchmen and farmers in a bad light. And it wasn't that Charlie was opposed to the person, but he liked the country wild, and he liked it picturesque, and he liked it when it was grasslands and wild people and wild animals. That was just his preference. And he's not ashamed to say so in this letter to this fella. The painting itself is just, I think it's in the Amon Carter Museum, and it is just a phenomenal piece of work. And one of the reasons I like it so much was, as a horse enthusiast and having made my living with horses for a long time, I want them to look like this medicine man's horse looks in this picture. It's just to me, it's the epitome of what I would like my horses to be. They're focused and they're relaxed, but they're attentive, and you can just read all that in this painting. Charlie really knew how to make a horse look real in a painting, and I've always liked it for that reason. Again, this is an example of Charlie's sentiment, and so you're getting this frontiersman, if you will, who came to a wild land and wasn't bent on making it tame. He's one of the few guys that wanted it to stay wild. And there were probably far more guys that felt that way than you actually get to hear about. But because Charlie wrote these letters, because he revealed his heart to these people in the letters, you get a really good look at how he saw his world and how he saw the changes that were taking place to it. And there are not a lot of examples that are this rich, I think, from that time period. I haven't read everyone's diary, and I don't know all the histories, but for me, it goes through and through and through Charlie's work, not just his sentiments, but the amazing representations that he puts forth, whether it's in the written word or in the visual art itself.
In a wonderful biography of Charlie Russell, written by Ramon Adams and Homer Britzman, I found this quote about Charlie Russell's poetry. Few people look upon Charlie Russell as a poet, yet he had talent along this line too. Very little of his poetry was ever published. It was not written for this purpose. Often, when writing an old friend, this poetic talent came to the surface that he might better express some sentiment resting upon his heart.
Charlie didn't just write letters and illustrated letters. In fact, I don't know that I know of any letters that he wrote without an illustration. I can't think of an example of one, but he wrote a lot of poems through his career, and he knew several poets of the time period, and one of them was Johnny Rich, a really good friend of his, a range cowboy who went on to other things. But they weren't all elaborate, long story poems with Charlie. A lot of times they were pretty quick, and they might be on a Christmas card, or they might be with a little sketch or a painting or a drawing or something. There's one of my personal favorites of Charlie's was a little verse. I'll call them verses instead of poems, because a lot of people wouldn't consider them poetry, but they're rhymes, and there's some of Charlie's pieces that are just rhymes, but there are some that are much more. One of my favorites was on a Christmas card that he sent to a good friend of his whose name was Josephine Trigg, and Josephine was Albert Trigg's daughter. Albert Trigg, we talked about earlier, owned the Brunswick Bar. Good friends with Charlie, had a lot of his artwork, could afford to buy his artwork at the time, and not everybody could. And Josephine was Albert Trigg's daughter and a really dear friend to Charlie. And Josephine was a good calligrapher. So when Charlie wanted to have the piece of poetry or the little rhyme clearly legible, he would get Josephine to do the calligraphy. He'd paint the painting that went along, and he'd get Josephine to do the calligraphy. But in this instance, the message was for Josephine, and it arrived on a Christmas card. And the Christmas card I'll describe, and it was because the Triggs were from back east. Charlie painted a woodland Indian in the early days of our country. He was standing next to a road where a European couple clearly in a sleigh, were traveling in the snow in the wintertime, and this Indian man has harvested a buck deer, and he is offering it as a gift to this couple. And so that's the painting. And it's really a cool painting because you don't see many deciduous forests in Charlie's painting. It's all mostly more Western stuff. But, and the verse that came with the painting said, "A gift can't be measured by value nor pound, nor counting the coin that it cost. A tune from a fiddle's a mighty sweet gift, but ain't long left the bow till she's lost. The ear lost the music, but the heart held the sound, and corralled all the goodness it meant. For a gift from the heart without measure nor pound, that don't cost the giver a cent. Love is a giver of gifts, and friendship's his husky mate, and it's the slices of heart that come with the gift that give every gift its weight." C.M. Russell, 1914. Charlie, as I said, was a totally immersed participant in the range cowboy's life when he first came to Montana, and that included some pretty serious drinking. That was sort of the adult entertainment, among other things. And so he was quite the rounder in his youth, and he didn't make a big deal out of that. He didn't brag about that. He certainly didn't deny that his participation. But in 1908, Charlie decided to quit drinking for good. And so someone asked him why he quit drinking, and he said, "I found I couldn't mix alcohol and paint." So that was his answer to that. But he painted this New Year's Christmas card, and the picture, the image, was three cowboys, and they're all horseback, and they've got a bottle of whiskey between them, and they're at a fork in a trail, and there are two little signs. One's on one trail, and one's on the other trail. And so if you get your timing back, this was during Prohibition, or just right at that time period. One trail led to a temperance lecture, and there was one set of tracks on that trail, and then the other trail led to Poker Jake's Palace, and it was, of course, full of tracks. And so, and with an empty booze bottle laying next to the sign pointing to Poker Jake's Palace. And then the little caption that was underneath the painting said, "It's time for good resolutions. That's what the pious folks say. But if tracks don't lie, it's plain to the eye, there ain't been but one made today." And so, once again, he's using his great sense of humor to make his point. But I've always felt like that particular New Year's greeting, which happened to coincide with when he quit drinking, was kind of a self-portrait of him. So, yeah. And there are others. Charlie was a remarkably, I think, he was just a remarkably nostalgic and sentimental guy. Everybody can see that in his paintings too. And in about 1916, Charlie and Nancy adopted a 3-month-old little boy. They couldn't have children for whatever reason. No one really knows, and I don't know that they ever did. But they named him Jack, and so they had this little boy, and Charlie just adored him. And it's interesting when you see photographs of Charlie Russell, he's usually very stoic in the photograph, unless there are children also in the photograph. And then he's smiling or he's doing something. It was really interesting to me. And I know everybody back then sort of got froze in front of a camera, and it was really probably uncomfortable for them getting pictures taken. They all looked so very serious. But Charlie loved kids, and he loved Christmas. And he did these great things about Christmas. He would paint these elaborate paintings, and one of them, it was a Christmas card, clearly. And this is a little example of Charlie's Christmas poetry. There's a winter scene, and there's a cowboy. He's horseback. He's trudging through the snow. He's got a bottle of booze in his pocket, And there in the swirling snow is this Santa Claus and 8 reindeer. And they're sort of flying through the air, and the horse is spooking, and the guy's looking, and that's the picture, that's the painting. And then the poem says, I've knowed of men a-having snakes and other swarms of bats. Some had spiders in their clothes and turkeys with plug hats. Old whiskey was to blame for this, for drinking was the cause. I guess I'll have to quit the booze 'cause I got Santa Claus. And so that went along with that great painting. And then even that piece of rhyme is illustrated. There's a turkey in a top hat, there's a bat, there's a snake crawling around, and then there's a surprised cowboy in an overcoat with Santa Claus standing in front of him and a little mistletoe in the background. But it's typical Charlie. And some of his poems, other than being humorous and short and quick, were a little more lengthy. After he and Nancy adopted Jack, he wrote a poem about Christmas in the line camp. It's, again, a super incredible painting. In my opinion, some of Charlie's best work was on these illustrated letters, even more so than his really famous Bronc to Breakfast and, Laugh Kills Lonesome and all these fabulous paintings. If you could see the detail and the night, it's a night scene, which he did very few of, which is interesting to me about Charlie, too. Charlie knew that Frederick Remington did fabulous night scenes. He was really famous for those night scenes. And Charlie, he kind of stayed away from them. He didn't want to try to copy, but he did other things better. And there was another artist who he said, Charlie's description of him was, he paints the wettest water I ever saw. And Charlie didn't do that. He just didn't do what other guys did best. He did his own thing. But this is one of the night scenes, and it's really fabulous. And it's Santa Claus and his reindeer pulled up to this little cook shack. And this is the poem that accompanied it. There's a confused cowboy standing in the door looking at Santa Claus. Last night I drifted back in dreams to childhood's stomping ground. I'm in my little bed, it seems, the old folks whispering round. My socks is hung, Ma's tucked me in. It's Christmas Eve, you see. I've said my prayers, blessed all my kin. I'm good as good can be. But suddenly I'm awakened wide from out this youthful dream by jingling bells that's outside hung on some restless team. Reminded by rheumatic shin, lumbagoed back that's sore, a whiskered face and hair that's thin, I ain't no kid no more. So getting my boots, I open the door, and I'm sure surprised to see an old-time freighter I've knowed before, but it's years since he called on me. He's an undersized Skinner, good-natured and stout, with a team like himself all small. It's that same old cuss Maud told me about, Santa Claus, reindeer and all. Now he's holding the ribbons like an old-timer would when he nods his head to me. I sure be obliged if you'd set me straight. I'm away off the track, says he. I follow the trail of the stork. It's strange, me missing his track this way. But I'm guessing that bird never touched this range, for there's no sign of children I see. You bachelors have a good way, winning wherever you're found, the 4th of July and St. Paddy's Day a-passing the drinks around. But to know the joys of Christmas, you must be acquainted with 3. For a home's but a camp without these things. That's a wife, the stork, and me. Well, about that time my bunkmate growls, and he groans in a grumpy way. You got all the bedding, and I'm cold as a snake. Hey, isn't this Christmas Day? So that came right after he adopted a little boy. Once again, you see a little bit of the heart of the man in the sentiments between the lines, Clearly, Christmas was great for Charlie at other times, but he felt like it couldn't compare once he had a wife and a child and a home, So, pretty cool stuff.
I'd like to read a piece that Charlie Russell wrote near the end of his life that he entitled, A Few Words About Myself. The papers have been kind to me, many times more kind than true. Although I worked for many years on the range, I'm not what the people think a cowboy should be. I was neither a good roper nor a rider. I was a night wrangler. How good I was, I'll leave it for the people I worked for to say. There's still a few of them living. In the spring, I wrangled horses. In the fall, I herded beef. I worked for the big outfits and always held my job. I have many friends among cowmen and cowpunchers. I've always been what is called a good mixer. I had friends when I had nothing else. My friends were not always within the law, but I haven't said how law-abiding I was myself. I haven't been too bad nor too good to get along with. Life has never been too serious with me. I live to play, and I'm playing yet. Laughs and good judgment has saved me many a black eye, but I don't laugh at others' tears. I was a wild young man, but age has made me gentle. I drank, but never alone, and when I drank, it was no secret. I'm still friendly with drinking men. My friends are mixed, preachers, priests, and sinners. I belong to no church, but am friendly toward and respect all of them. I've always liked horses, and since I was 8 years old, have always owned a few. I am old-fashioned and peculiar in my dress. I am eccentric. That is a polite way of saying you're crazy. I believe in luck and have had lots of it. To have talent is no credit to its owner. What man can't help, he should get neither credit nor blame for. It's not his fault. I am an illustrator. There are lots better ones, but some worse. Any man that can make a living doing what he likes is lucky, and I'm that. Any time I cash in now, I win.
The first book of Charlie's illustrated letters, I don't know when the publishing date was, but I think it was in the 1940s. And his wife, Nancy, put it together after Charlie's death. And that book is still available. That's called Good Medicine. That was even earlier, 1929, I believe Good Medicine was. And it has a foreword by Will Rogers. And then there was some books afterwards of these illustrated letters. But the book that I kind of used the most was a book that was, I think it's 10 or 15 years old now. I'm not positive when the publishing date was. But the book itself is a big coffee table book, and it was put together by Brian Dippy, who's, as I said earlier, the most knowledgeable guy on Charlie. It was published in 1993 by the Amon Carter Museum down Fort Worth, and it's called Charles M. Russell Word Painter, Letters 1887 through 1926. And that's a great resource if these letters are of interest to anybody. This book is no longer in print, but you can find copies of it, used copies, on Amazon or used book searches. And I'd recommend getting one if you can. It's a fantastic piece of research, and it's super enjoyable. It's the most used book in my house. And then there's another book that Brian Dippy put together with the Amon Carter Museum, and it's also out of print. It's a smaller book, and it's the 100 Best Letters of C.M. Russell. And those two books are just fabulous, really great paper, really great reproductions. The artwork is just spectacular on them. And there are other little things I found through the years. Friends of mine, Elizabeth Deere, put together a little book of Charlie's letters called Regards to the Bunch, and that might still be out there through the C.M. Russell Museum in Great Falls. A catalog raisonné, Byron Price's edited that and put it together. There's a great book called Photographing the Legend. There are lots of new productions of Charlie's paintings, sculptings, and letters that are available now, and they're incredibly good representations of the originals. The ability to reproduce that stuff now is just at a peak. And so the old books have some pretty poor color images of reproductions. They just don't compare to the new stuff that's available. And they're available through Amon Carter. They're available through C.M. Russell Museum. There's a great book supply at the Montana Historical Society in Helena, where the C.M. Russell McKay collection resides. So lots of resources for anybody who's interested in pursuing these letters and history about Charlie further.
In an essay about Charlie Russell entitled The Conservatism of Charles M. Russell, J. Frank Dobie wrote these words: "If the Old West was important to itself, Charlie Russell was important also, for he was, in art, its most representative figure. If the Old West is still important to the modern West, Russell remains equally important. If the Old West is important to faraway lands and people, Charles M. Russell is important. He not only knew the West, he felt it. It moved him, motivated him, and gave him articulation, as a strong wind on some barren crag shapes all the trees that try to grow there."
So around 1908, I think, right in there somewhere, 1908, 1909, Charlie somehow had gotten a letter from an old friend of his named Ed Botsford. And this Ed Botsford, he was a real Montana pioneer. He drove a herd of cattle north to Montana from Texas in 1888. And shortly after that, he worked on the Bear Paw Mountain Roundup with Charlie. So right around 1889, or maybe as late as 1890, he and Charlie worked together on these cattle pools that was their title then. We call them grazing associations now. But after he worked with Charlie, he quit the range, and Ed Botsford joined the Buffalo Bill Wild West show, and he spent the rest of his career in the Wild West show of Buffalo Bills. There were so many of those, but that one was pretty prominent. And somehow he and Charlie renewed their acquaintance through the mail, and Charlie sent a letter back to his friend Ed. And the picture in the letter is Charlie on a horse. And it's just this, it takes up half the page. It's just a self-portrait of Charlie horseback on one of his horses. But the letter says this. It says, "Friend Ed, the above sketch shows me and my old horse. We are both has-beens, though there was a day when this pony was some cow hoss. But time has played hell with both of us. I don't doubt that he tells his cayuse friends what a whirlwind he was, and Ed, I'm not the kid you knew and rode with 20 years ago on the Bear Paw Range. I never was a top hand, but today I'm plumb harmless. Ed, this business is almost history now, and there's no need for men like us. You punch cows in a show, and I ride on canvas. Your old compadre, C.M. Russell." I always really liked that letter. I liked it for its simplicity, but also for its perspective. We're talking 1908 here, and Charlie sees the whole thing as being over, and we're still clinging to what's left of it, in 2021. So I think that's pretty cool. Charlie's perspective was what was better than what is right now in his life. And he wrote early in his career, he has this great little poem with a great painting, and the painting was a buffalo skull, and there were some Indian artifacts with it, and these lines: "The West is dead, my friend, but writers hold the seed, and what they sow will live and grow again for those who read." And I always liked that because that was Charlie's heartfelt sentiment, that the West was dead. But he also knew that it would be the artists and the writers who planted the seed of what was that would grow again, and that Renaissance would continue, or at least the revival of the West was going to happen in some form from now on. I really think Charlie probably knew that. As long as his paintings survived, and there is a tension there between what was and what is now. And, I was born 100 years after Charlie. I couldn't there's no way I could experience what the world he experienced at that time. And even though he loved his world the way it was, as a cowboy in Montana for a career, I loved my world just as much as he loved his, And even though it's different, even though there's cars and planes and all of that, which Charlie saw the beginning of all that. He never would drive a car. He never learned. He hated them. But Nancy had two. She had two very expensive cars, and he gave her that privilege. But he just didn't care about them at all. He rode a horse till the end. But you're right. There is this tension between what was and what's happening right now. And even in my lifetime, the ranching culture's changed. There's some really good things happening with land use, with grassland management, with low-stress livestock handling, with better horse practices, that are far less dangerous for both the horse and the human, and produce a better product in the end. So there's some really cool stuff that's happened, but there is stuff that's been lost. And myself and guys like me, we wonder, wouldn't it have been great to see what they saw, to participate in to ride through a landscape with no fences, with no barriers except whatever natural obstruction might be there, That's just a privilege we'll never see. So all we can do is imagine, really. But we still value what we have, just the way Charlie valued what he has. And I don't know any people who lean in the cowboy direction, whether they're ranchers or cowboys or mountain men, or if that's your interest, there's just nobody out there who doesn't yearn a little bit for what is lost. But I think that's part of helping keep the value in what is here is, I'm still making a living horseback for the most part. And these guys like Charlie, the guys that he cowboyed with, they didn't just only cowboy for a living. When that job ran out, they got something else going. And so just like us, they had to adapt to the times. And of course, we have this romantic, nostalgic look back. But Charlie carried that all the way through. He was already nostalgic at 20 years old. He was looking back toward Francis Parkman and the guys that came in 1840 instead of the guys that were there in 1880, So I think that's just a natural byproduct of loving something, being passionately interested in it, and wishing you could have seen the whole thing from the start. Nobody gets to live that long. Another interesting thing about Charlie that I really like, and that was the fact that he used a bull buffalo skull as part of his signature, and he used it on his letterheads. And we read that letter to Ralph Budd where it's obvious that Charlie thinks the buffalo ought to be the symbol of the West. And so he didn't, of course, force that on anybody. That's not the kind of guy he was. But he borrowed that symbol, and it's on most of his pieces. It's on most of his letters as a letterhead. It's on many of his signatures. There's a little bison skull. And even on some of his major paintings, there's a little bison skull with his signature. That's how much he valued that particular part of the West. As Charlie's career progressed, as he became more of a world celebrity than just a local Montana artist, he and Nancy traveled quite a bit. They made a trip down to Florida. They made a trip to London. They made many trips actually out to California. And eventually Nancy bought a lot in Pasadena, and she had a place built, and they called it Trails End. And that's where, after Charlie died, he did not want to leave Great Falls. He didn't want to leave Montana. But after Charlie died, Nancy moved on to California with what was left of Charlie's paintings and made her life there. So the Russells spent every year, they went to California for some time, a month or maybe sometimes more, 2 months in the wintertime. They would go to California. Sometimes it was another season. But Charlie wrote some great letters back from California. This is one he wrote in 1920. And he was writing to a Great Falls friend. Many of the letters were addressed to people from Great Falls. And especially when he traveled somewhere, most of the letters were sent back home to his cronies to talk about what he was doing out in the world. And he wrote this letter. It says, "I guess you think I am a long time answering your letter, but you know me. If the sands of old Dad Time were as slow as me, the Rocky Mountains wouldn't yet be foothills. Your letter was mighty interesting and told me much of the country you're living in. Sorry to hear that your wife was sick, and I hope she is well soon and strong as ever. I also hope that you, old friend, have that good horse called Health underneath you. He's been a good one to most of us, and we often ride him too hard, so don't use your spurs till you hit level country. Friend Berners, maybe you've been down in this country, but I'm going to tell you what I think of it." And this is California that he's describing. "It's the warmest looking and coldest feeling. If flowers tell warmth, this country is a liar. It's strictly man-made. But few of the trees and plants that grow and seem to thrive belong here. There are flowers blooming everywhere, but that don't mean you won't need an overcoat. It's like standing in a foot of snow, looking through a window at a painting of the tropics. The picture shows heat, but it don't warm your feet. Every street and road is crowded with honking cars. Even the skies are noisy. The roar of the flyers is always overhead. Man has taken the road from the birds, and the few I have seen seem restless and frightened. On most any street in Hollywood, you are apt to see an auto wreck. Maybe it's on the square. But if you hear a man call to the blood-smeared lady they are dragging from under the wreck, 'What the hell's wrong with you, Rosalie? Can't you look like you're dead?' Well, this gentleman is a director, and nearby is a man turning a crank on a movie camera. It's the same thing on the country roads. Suddenly from a grove of live oaks there bursts a band of riders. For looks they're sure scary, all heeled to the teeth and spurring down the slopes with their guns smoking. There are flashes of silver where the sun dances on the horse jewelry of this bunch. And as I said before, this looks scary, but they're plumb harmless. The leader of this band is Bill Hart or Tom Mix or some other movie gunman, too fanciful to be real. But to an old romance-loving boy like me, it's the best thing I've seen in California. At least they're live men with living horses under them. Now, Berners, don't ever let the boosters see this letter. It's a cinch I won't stand well with the native sons. Best wishes to you and yours, your friend C.M. Russell." This was a really cool letter for the illustrations as well, and it starts with a little palm tree-covered bungalow with airplanes in the sky and cars honking on the street. You can hardly see the street for the cars, and then a big car crash, and then a bunch of cowboys riding down through the hills of California. Anyway, Charlie got a big kick out of what was happening in the movie industry in California, and he loved to lampoon them, but he also really enjoyed it. This particular letter is also to an old friend back in Great Falls from California where Charlie and Nancy were staying in the winter. And I'll describe the scene. It's on his typical letterhead with a buffalo skull at the top, C.M. Russell, Great Falls, Montana, just under the buffalo skull. And then there's this beach scene. And it's Charlie, and he's standing in the clothes he always wore with his red Métis sash around his waist. And then off to Charlie's left, in the foreground of the picture, there are all these body types. And there's a real shapely woman, and there's a not-so-shapely man, and there's an old guy with a cane, and there's young kids running around. And they're in the swimming suits from the 1920s, all kinds of sizes and shapes. And gulls are flying in the air, and Charlie, of course, is he's fully dressed like any cowboy would be, and he's standing there gawking at all this action on the beach. And so he writes to his friend George, "This sketch will show you that I'm still in California. I was at the beach the other day, and if truth goes naked, like they say, it's a mighty honest bunch at the seashore. A man that ties to a lady down here after seeing her in a bathing suit ain't gambling much. All her cards are face up on the table. It's a good place to pick 'em, but it's sometimes hell to hold 'em. This is a good country for lawyers and preachers. One's tying them, and the other's untying them, and they're both busy. Your friend, C.M. Russell. I just find it hilarious that he's describing these people as nearly naked in their 1920s bathing suits compared to what we see today. It's pretty hilarious. Yeah.
In another passage in the biography of Charlie Russell written by Ramon Adams and Homer Britzman, these words are found about Russell's friend, Brother Van. Outstanding among Charlie Russell's friendships was that between the cowboy artist and Reverend W. W. Van Orsdale, pioneer Montana Methodist minister. Brother Van, as he was affectionately called by saint and sinner alike, came up the Missouri River on the steamboat Far West to Fort Benton in 1872, singing to pay his passage. He arrived at Fort Benton on a Sunday and wasted no time in preaching his first sermon in Montana. The Four Deuces Saloon holds the honor of housing this first religious service, and it was there the noted preacher was dubbed Brother Van by an Army scout from the fort. William Wesley Van Orsdale was too big a mouthful for a Westerner.
There was a character out in Montana at the same time Charlie was, who I think outlived Charlie actually, and his name was William Wesley Van Orsdale, and he was a circuit riding preacher. And Charlie had a great deal of respect for him, and so did everybody else. And he lived a real frontiersman's life, and he traveled, and he brought the gospel to people, but he was legit. He was the real deal, and that's why everybody really respected him. He was having a birthday party, and Charlie had been invited because it was kind of a landmark birthday, but he couldn't. He wasn't able to go. He was on jury duty. But he sent this illustrated letter, and I think it really is a great summation of Charlie's experience in Montana and how he felt about it. The image on the letter is the Missouri River, and there's a big herd of bison, and it's strung out on both sides of the river, and it's crossing the river, and there's a steamboat on the river waiting for this giant herd of bison to cross the river. And at that time, of course, it was a bit of a stretch because in Charlie's time, he was about 50 years too late, really, to see buffalo in those numbers. But it was legendary in Lewis and Clark's journals. They talk about having to wait for these giant bison herds to cross the river. They might have to wait a day because there were so many millions of bison at the time. But it's an old picture of old Montana, and it's directed to Brother Van, is what William Wesley Van Orsdale was called by everybody, referred to him as Brother Van. And Charlie writes this in his letter: I received an invitation to your birthday party from Reverend Bunch, and I am more than sorry that I can't be there. I think it was about this time of year 37 years ago that we first met at Babcock's Ranch in the Pig Eye Basin on the Upper Judith. I was living at that time with a hunter and a trapper named Jake Hoover, who you will remember. He and I had come down from the South Fork with 3 pack horses loaded with deer and elk meat, which we sold to the ranchers, and we had stopped with old Bab, a man as rough as the mountains he loved, but who was all heart from his belt up. And friends or strangers were welcome to shove their feet under his table. This all-welcome way of his made the camp a hangout for many a homeless mountain and prairie man, and his log walls and dirt roof seemed like a palace to those who lived mostly under the sky. The evening you came, there was a mixture of bullwhackers and prospectors who welcomed you with handshakes and rough but friendly greetings. I was the only stranger to you, so after Babs introduced Kid Russell, he took me to one side and he whispered, "Boy," says he, "I don't savvy many psalm singers, but Brother Van deals square." And when we all sat down to our elk meat, beans, coffee, and dried apples under the rays of a bacon grease light, these men who knew little of law, and one among them I knew wore notches on his gun, men who had not prayed since they knelt at their mother's knee, bowed their heads while you, Brother Van, gave thanks. And when you finished, someone said amen, and I'm not sure, but I think it was the man who I heard later had been a road agent. I was 16 years old then, Brother Van, but I have never forgotten your stay at Old Bab's with men whose talk was generally emphasized with fancy profanity. But while you were with us, although they had to talk slow and careful, there was never a slip. The outlaw at Bab's was a sinner, and none of us were saints, but our hearts were clean, at least while you gave thanks, and the hold-up man said amen. You brought to the minds of these hardened homeless men the face of their mothers, and few can be bad when she is near. I have met you many times in lonely places, but you were never alone or lonesome, for a man with scarred hands and feet stood beside you, and near him there is no hate. So all met and loved you. Brother Van, you have ridden that trail a long time, and I hope you still ride to many birthdays on this side of the big range. With best wishes from my best half and me, your friend, C.M. Russell.
All right, folks, that's it for today's episode. I'd like to thank Randy Rieman for taking the time to visit with me. You can find out more about Randy at randyrieman.com. I'd like to thank Flint Custom Hats right here in Lubbock, Texas, for sponsoring today's episode. You can find out more about Flint Hats and order your very own custom hat at flinthat.com. I'd like to thank Hal Cannon for playing the Cowboy Crossroads theme song. You can find out more about Hal at halcannon.com. If you're enjoying Cowboy Crossroads and would like to help me keep it going, you can become a patron of the podcast at patreon.com/cowboycrossroads. That's patreon.com/cowboycrossroads. I'd like to thank my Trail Boss patrons Bob Kelly and Chris Ryden for their support of this episode. You can also make a donation on my website at andyhedges.com. If you'd like to contact me with a question or a comment or a story, I'd love to hear from you. Send an email to andy@andyhedges.com. Thank you for listening to Cowboy Crossroads.